in discussion points, because this is really what it is, a discussion. We will provide a little bit of an introduction, but we want to hear your thoughts on how to fund the PSA, how we can build in funding in such a way that it helps the PSA become more diverse, because we have a firm belief that if we do the funding part right, we can change the nature of the PSA in its entirety, particularly in relation to diversity. Perhaps before going to the next point, just wanted to briefly introduce ourselves. So Neil Lewis Jr. Is at Cornell University, and I'm personally at Université Grenoble-Alpes and Institut Universitaire de France, both in France. So to very briefly give an overview of the Psychological Science Accelerator, it was founded in 2018 as a collaborative network to crowdsource research. Chris Chartier in 2018 started it all with a tweet and a blog post where he wanted to start an equivalent of CERN's Hadron Collider for psychology. So a small group of people got together and started working on the first project, which was led by Ben Jones, which was a replication of a project on face perception, and they wanted to see if this project replicated across geographical regions. And the spoiler alert is it didn't. The PSA grew and grew from there on with a founding document outlining its core principles, which includes transparency, democratic governance, but importantly, also stressing the need for diversity in various different forms. It has seen an incredible growth over the last few years. In the first few years, from 2018 to 2020, there were a little under 500 members. In the period after that, it almost doubled with the call for studies around the COVID-19 pandemic, and there has been a steady growth since then. However, and this is important, the PSA has essentially been reproducing the problems we wanted to solve, and this, of course, is an enormous problem. Over 2/3 of PSA members are from, for lack of a better term, because I think it is a problematic term in itself, but for lack of a better term, from weird countries, and most accepted proposals come from the United States and to a lesser extent from Northwestern Europe. Go for it, Neil.
Yeah. So one of the reasons that we think this problem is occurring, that we're continuing to sort of reproduce some of the problems we were founded to address, is that we really have limitations in core funding for doing this work, right? So the ways that research gets done, it's sort of similar to what was done before. The resources for it really come from the researchers and the research teams that are driving the work. And so we're really relying heavily on the resources that members already have, right? So there's limited core funding for supporting all the work across the world that needs to be done to really have true geographic and other forms of representation. And we've tried to solve this in a few different ways. So as a Funding and Finance Committee, part of what we did, a big part of what we did from the time we started, was really trying to secure some core funding. So we applied to big federal grants to get sort of core infrastructure funding to be able to fund the variety of things that people in the PSA want to do. But that process has been somewhat challenging over time. So, the PSA's mission of democratically selecting the studies that members want to do is somewhat at odds with the funding mechanisms that currently exist. So, the times when we've gone to the big funders and say, hey, we want funding, and we can't tell you exactly which studies we're going to do because we have a democratic selection process. They've been quite nervous about that. They like to give money to exactly what a particular project wants to do, and that's not necessarily the way that we do things in the PSA. So that's been challenging to get some core funding, but particularly from governmental funding bodies, which at least in the US tends to be where some of the bigger core funding opportunities come from. But we've had some success with foundations. So there's a recent Templeton grant to support PSA projects. And some universities that members are from have also chipped in some funds to support PSA-related projects. And some of those are there on the screen. So those have been some of the ways that we've been funded so far. But again, you're seeing part of this challenge of, well, money is coming from some of these places that are more well-resourced to begin with. Another funding mechanism we've had is some crowdfunding. So we had a Patreon account for a while that's recently being transitioned into our fiscal sponsor, which is a new way of managing PSA funds that we've been rolling into recently. But that's generally produced smaller amounts of funds. You have some PSA members who've been contributing like monthly donations and things like that. And that's been another way that we've been getting some funding, but that's smaller amounts of funding than the bigger grants that are out there. So this differential resource issue sort of perpetuates inequality in the PSA, right? So we are in the situation where, as Hans mentioned earlier, a lot of the researchers and projects are still being driven by people in weird countries, people who can still find resources at their universities and elsewhere to put up the funds that it takes to do this research. And so we really need to find new opportunities to diversify our funding streams and be able to distribute funding across regions. This has been a core challenge that we really want to spend some time today thinking through ways that we might work on that, because otherwise we're really not going to be able to move the needle on this problem. There are some legal and logistical processes we have to work through with that. So, how you transfer money from institution to institution looks a little bit different depending on which countries we're talking about, and some of the legal guidelines around that. There are some logistical hurdles that we've worked through with some projects of, getting money, let's say, from one university to another university to help cover some of the costs. Or from the PSA to universities, that creates some logistical challenges we've been trying to work through, but we have to solve some of those problems in order to really achieve our goals of diversifying how we do psychological science. And so changing this sort of funding can really, we think, change the geographical nature of the PSA, but we really have to work through some of these issues.
So I think there are a number of different questions that we would like to discuss in this specific section of this conference. So what kind of strategies should we pursue for supporting members beyond North America and Western Europe? What barriers will we need to overcome as we pursue this global strategy for the PSA? Perhaps you may also mention some opportunities that we may be unaware of that may support these initiatives. We will not only do this in this meeting, so we will be preparing kind of a request PSA-wide for people to contribute to this. And are there also other points that the PSA should be considering? So it is very likely that with our limited lens and our limited focus and our limited understanding that there will be many points that we're missing. What are we missing in terms of kind of thinking about funding and finance for big team science?
Yeah, I mean, we really welcome input here. We've been, some ideas have come to mind, but again, as Hans said, there are probably lots of other things we're missing and lots of other considerations we should be having. And so we really want to think through this collectively so that we get this right.
And before, I think, turning to the discussion, we also want to extend an open invitation to join our committee to keep thinking through these issues. And we also have written bylaws for this committee. And we would really welcome comments on the bylaws from the different people here present, because like I said, we will miss things. We have a limited understanding of the world, and it would be helpful to have input from people from other regions on our bylaws so that the focus on geographical diversity is built in from the beginning with the Funding and Finance Committee. And there, I think we want to open it up.
Yeah, we want to open up and hear what's top of mind for you and how we can work together to solve this issue. Maybe we can stop sharing and then we can see everyone.
Sure. What I can do maybe is I can share the questions in the chat.
Mhm.
And of course, this is just a starting point. Yeah, that's why I'm pasting the questions now in the chat.
Should we start choose one, or should we go on chronological, but in order? Like it doesn't.
I don't have a strong preference. It kind of depends if people have strong thoughts about one of the points, or just even want to bring up an entirely different point. That's fine if there's something on the top of their mind. If that's not the case, then maybe we can go through them one by one.
And the other things, one of the things that also happens when you're part of a committee, it's kind of becomes like an echo chamber. We all like listen to each other and like no. And these are some of the questions that we've kind of come up with, and Hans and Neil have come up with. And if there's something else that you might think that any of you might think is an issue that might be important for financing, partly PSA, but also like any other initiative that might Heidi's here from Many Babies, even our ABRIR. Is there something that we can all do to make funding and therefore making psychological science better for everybody? We ran into a couple issues when we were doing an ABRIR. We had some wonderful people from Turkey and from Iran help us translate materials, and we were even within our same founding members, we couldn't, not everybody could get PayPal. And so because we got some funding for translation, and so a lot of people, like for example, Alma has been working for free nonstop. And I think sending money, receiving money is such a horrible logistic issue that by the time that we got the money and we tried to send it everywhere, I think it ended up being something like 70% of the money that we had, or 80% of the money that we had, because it got sent to me in Mexico. And so whatever the exchange rate was at that time, and then I sent it to India for website and other things that Aish was doing, and then sent it to Brazil. I still haven't been able to send it to Alma because I haven't figured out other, I think it's WISE that she was telling me that she could get, and that the wonderful researchers from Turkey could get. So I think that's an important issue as well. That I can just keep on talking. So should we just start with the first question and then go from there? And then if other issues come up, then people can come in. So the first one that's up here is like, what strategies should we pursue for supporting members beyond North America and Western Europe? And we're very happy to hear all and any opinions.
And maybe also to rephrase what I was saying earlier, you can also be selfish in mentioning points that are relevant for you. You don't have to solve the global challenge, because that's kind of what I mean with, we're probably blind to certain issues that you would have to deal with directly. So feel free to share your own challenges in participating in big team science or research more generally.
I mean, it sounds like one, we've heard about some of these logistical issues with money transfers, but Nadia, one of the things you just said about exchange rates was one that we haven't even factored into how we think about these challenges, right? That those are floating and will change. So if you budget for one amount of money, it is what the thing costs at that point in time. And given how long some of the transfer processes can take, the value of that amount might change depending on which countries we're working with. And that's something we have to keep front and center.
So Aish posted something here, not much of a barrier, but just to signpost how big team science does assist. I collaborated on PSA 006 study as a data collection lab. I'm an early career academic, just doing my first year PhD now. And I would have absolutely not been able to handle publishing costs at Nature if it weren't for collaborative publishing. For example, Nature Open Access publishing costs about I'm going to pronounce this incorrectly, lakhs, and which is equivalent to like a TA's yearly salary. And I think that's something that that is for most of our countries, including Mexico. It's just and Natalia's putting in Brazil as well. We were talking yesterday about having internships as editors and how sometimes they're paid. And we were saying that the dream is getting paid in dollars and then spending them in pesos. But the opposite is just horrible. Like just earning in pesos or reales or anywhere else, and then trying to pay a publishing fee is just incredibly it's not doable at all. And then it also, sometimes we get some funding from our universities to pay for those costs, but then we're using like those very precious either state or federal money that we could be using for local things, and they're going elsewhere. So I think that's a good point that you bring up, Aish. Thank you.
And because many journals do provide waivers, even though I realize that it is not an ideal system, because one, it's not great to ask for a waiver. Two, sometimes people are not familiar with the system and they may not even submit. Have you tried to ask for waivers despite the imperfection of the system?
There are a few things there, and sorry if anybody else wants to jump in. One is what you're talking about is that people don't know about it. Sometimes, as Crystal says, it only applies to the first author. Sometimes, like Mexico is I think, middle income country. So sometimes it doesn't apply for us. So even though we get like a discount, so instead of being, $13,000, it's like $7,000, which is still exorbitant amount of money. As I think we were talking yesterday in the finance meeting right before, it's 6 a.m. here, right before our the rest of the panels here. There are countries that are considered high income, but most of the people, I think it was Lily that was talking about it in our meeting yesterday, that most people don't have the money, even though it's considered a high income country. So the reality is not what is there. And
perhaps also something that is useful to know, because I work with massive students, of course, that don't have the income and cannot afford it either. But if you push hard enough, then oftentimes they're willing to go for it. So maybe it is also, not realizing that you can push hard, because it is also the case that the editor and the publisher are typically two separate entities. And so if you push the publisher, the editor won't really know about it and oftentimes not even care. So I think it is also worthwhile really like asserting yourself despite how kind of not nice it is. But yeah. I think Natalia also said something that is important. One thing that I also try to stress to graduate students, green open access for me is good enough, because particularly for graduate students, they may want to go for the traditional high impact factor journal, which is not open access. But as long as they post it on a preprint server, I'm satisfied, because then it's available for people.
Yeah, but I think there's a few issues there too. And I think I'd like to bring up about pushing. I think pushing it and like kind of fighting against, like not fighting, but like discussing with publishers or editors about fees is sometimes culturally not okay in some countries. So there's a lot of places, like in Mexico, like I have to tell my students, like, you have to argue with me. Like, I'm not right all the time. I know. You can ask my husband and my kid. Like, but sometimes I'll argue more than any of you, so I'll win. And so I think it culturally, it's not always something that we do because we just don't. And as Crystal was saying too, $20,000 is a lot of money, even for Americans, and for many, 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 many Americans. So I think what Natalia is saying, I think the best is to go with Diamond Open Access. Later today, I'm going to plug in an ad. Later today, we're going to talk about open access journals, and there's a lot within our regions that are starting to come up of just saying, okay, well, you're going to charge me $10,000. Maybe I'm just going to publish within my country and not get paid, not pay, and not have other people pay. Alexandra saying here, same for Serbia, it's middle income economy, but it's not always eligible for discounts and waivers. I solved it once by appointing an author with institutional funding as the corresponding authors. Their society covered the cost because they were the corresponding author, even if they were not the lead or the lead authors of the study. And I think that's a huge problem too, because just because you want not to pay for it, somebody else gets the credit for the work that you're doing. And so these are maybe not the best solution for the problems, and we just have to work around it.
See, Crystal has a hand.
Oh, yes, Crystal, please.
No worries. If folks are wanting to keep talking about publishing, I had a different point that I wanted to bring up, so I was just waiting for. I was curious, this might be potentially for anybody, but especially for folks doing the finance stuff at PSA, if there has been any attempt to pressure professional organizations to open up the way that they've thought about grants. And I'm thinking specifically, I'm posting 2 links in the chat. A few years ago, SIPS, the Society for the Improvement of Psychological Science, put together a global engagement task force, and I helped to lead that. And so one of the things that we found was that, you know, when we were talking to folks from outside of weird countries, if we're going to use that terminology, you know, they were saying a lot of the stuff that we're trying to do doesn't get funded under traditional structures, which is what you guys mentioned earlier. And so as a result, SIPS opened up the grants and aid program to help fund anything that was open science related, but not research or not traditionally funded. It could have funded research, but it was just like, it was kind of a general fund to say, like, if your project is not typically seen as fundable because it's not coming out with a paper or it's not, you know, a specific kind of research, you can apply for this. And so I'm wondering, especially with, I mean, SIPS is a pretty small organization. It doesn't have a whole lot of money floating around. Have folks tried approaching like APS or SPSP or SPICY or any of these other like large organizations that do have a lot more funding to say, not even just for PSA, but for these other projects generally, if we really want to move the needle on this, we need to broaden what we're willing to fund and what we're willing to support. So I was just curious at what folks' experiences were like with that.
If I may, I think Neil probably also has some things to say on this. I think we have done some lobbying. So we have approached APS, SPSP to see what is possible. In addition, within Europe, you also have infrastructure grants, which we weren't eligible before. I think now that we are closer to getting nonprofit status, or at least have the fiscal sponsorship, we would be eligible for those kind of grants. Other than that, I think you make a very good point, Crystal. I don't think we have done enough lobbying yet. So I think we can get more serious about lobbying and having really conversations with people developing the strategy at the different national granting agencies to say, listen, here's the problem. This is how potentially it can be solved. So I think we can get more serious about it. Now, I do think still, so Neil and I are starting to age a little bit already. I am more so than he is, but I do think it would help if we have even more experienced people that can support us in making that case, that are further in their career, that have done this work. So that's kind of where I hope we can get to, that we can try to get the support of more experienced people in the field that help make that case for us.
Yeah, building on that, the response is often, well, we have these, small grants program or whatever, similar to what SIPS has done. Like all of the major, at least social psych societies, SBSB, APS, and the like, have their small grant mechanisms, and they've supported some projects. But it's still you're applying for this this project funding, right? And how far can you make that money stretch, given how big these projects are and all the things, there are limitations in how far you can make that money stretch. And so, which is part of the need then for the larger infrastructure kinds of funding. But that requires, as you're saying, more of the kind of lobbying to make this case. We've tried to make the case with some funders, but again, with limited success.
Yeah, I always think that that's so funny, right? Because these organizations, they get free press kind of off of PSA. APS Observer has published several pieces on the PSA, and I'm sure I don't keep up with all of them, but I'm sure all these other organizations have as well. Mm-hmm. And it could be that they're maybe not aware of exactly how much it costs to run one of these studies, but I think it is interesting that and I don't know of a diplomatic way to point that out, but it is interesting that a lot of these organizations do get this kind of positive press from talking about how this is so important for the field and how their APS members or whoever engaged in these activities, but then to not actually offer financial support for that is I don't know of a diplomatic way of pointing that out, but it is something that's odd to me.
You do bring up a related point that we haven't talked about yet, which is we mostly don't quantify what it costs to do this work, right? We have been relying a lot on volunteer labor.
We did quantify it at one point. So we do, Chris, and I think you were involved in that as well. We had
one estimate of it at some point, but I don't know how broadly that was shared and how well people are aware of it. But this is one of the things that you're forced to do when you write project-specific grants. Like, you come up with a budget about what it all costs. And we don't always do that here. It costs a lot of personnel time, which there's a dollar amount to that we aren't always explicit about. But you're right, it does cost a lot of money. It takes a lot of resources to do this work. Those resources, or that true cost, is hidden. And that's true regardless of where you're doing research. This is part of why universities charge exorbitant overhead rates, is that there are real costs behind the scenes of doing this work. But those aren't always apparent to the people who are benefiting from telling the stories about it.
And Natalia suggested we should write an open letter. I think that can actually be a very nice idea. And also, maybe building off this conference, we can estimate the cost of one specific study, and maybe we can even take the PSA-CR studies, because I think that had a considerable impact in terms of our membership, and translate it to different languages and basically try to get it published so that different grant agencies see it.
Yeah.
See also what the impact is of the PSA, translate it to different languages, and try to publish it locally.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think it's a great point, Crystal. I think it is something, and I think one of the things that we haven't taken a look at is that it's a great document that Crystal shared of one of the things I started working one of those APS Observer papers, and I started looking at how we work in silos, even though we are many-many's. We're not like working together. And so SIPS has a wonderful grant and aid document. And we could be working with SIPS, we could be working with many babies, we could, you know, kind of an ABRIR and all of us together of like, how do we solve this problem? And I know that's why you, Hans and Neil, are here. Like, we're trying to kind of get together and see like, how can we do this, not just for PSA, but for everybody? What are the problems that we're running into? And what are the issues that we can solve and which ones that we can't, and how do we, more senior people, more younger people, more like, between all of us, we can come up with the solution and start pushing for the solution more. So I think that's where we can start pushing forward, stop being silos, start working together. And because the APS piece that we've been working on is about Latin America and how like our biggest, we don't work with each other. We like, Mexico works with the US and works, I mean, we're closer together geographically, I guess, but not necessarily other ways. So I think we need to start doing that, like working together. And sorry, Natalia, I saw your hand up. You want to go ahead?
Hi. No, I know you did. That's why I lowered. I knew you would say. You wouldn't forget me. So I've been noticing that there are a lot of research groups that are interested in the same issue. Not necessarily funding, but I bet they would be interested in that. But they work with other researchers internationally, and I think we perhaps have a better momentum to propose something, a letter or something where we can push for some changes. I don't know, I may be naive, but who knows. But I do wonder that one of the issues with societies or under funding agencies is how they can ship the money. Yeah, but there are other funding agencies that they do provide larger grants to international projects or to researchers working in a different country from where the funding agency is located. So I mentioned that before. We considered asking some of a person from these one of these agencies to come to our workshop. But I think Wellcome Trust, for example, from the UK, if I'm not mistaken, they have funding for projects in developing countries, and the researchers must be based in those developing countries or low and middle income countries. And so they must have some sort of logistics of how they work. Usually it goes straight to the institution, of course, and we have to deal with the thing about losing some money along the process, along the transaction process. But yeah, so I just wanted to say that perhaps some sort of document, an open letter or something could get things going. I don't know.
I mean, your comments touch on a few different things. One, there is funding out there that prioritizes different places, but part of it is what kind of entity can host the money. That was a part of what you're saying there. Like, so these funders are used to giving money to a university, for instance, giving it to this collaborative, which is basically what the PSA is different than what they're used to. And the behind the scenes contracting actually for some of the getting grants at a university is actually quite extensive in a way that most of us don't even see. Right. And there's a whole set of agreements with that. And that's part of the risk that people, big funders see with like giving money to this collaborative entity rather than to a researcher at a place that they're used to. And so that's some of like what we have to work through here. There's another piece of this. Anyway, thanks for raising that point, because these are like getting to some of the like legal and logistical pieces of doing this work. That's something we're having to think about.
If I could bring something else up,
Mhm.
I'm always going to talk if you don't stop me. But I think apart from getting the money to institutions, it's how it can be diverse within the institution as well. Like the way that like Cornell lets you spend money is not the same way that University of Sonora lets you spend money. So here I have struggled a lot. I have gotten grants, for example, from like Psychi. We have the first Psychi chapter in Mexico here in University of Sonora, and we gotten a bunch of like grants for research from undergraduate or graduate students, and a lot of it is like we earmark participant pay, but there's no way institutionally here to pay participants, and they've looked at me with like face of like, you're gonna pay whom? And and they're like, oh, so participants, the people that are helping you collect data. And I'm like, no, the people that I'm collecting the data from. And they're like, why? And so I think that's another huge issue too, of like how each university, once you get the money, which is already like, you know, a huge issue of like getting the money to your institution, like how you can spend it is a huge issue as well. And there are some granting agencies that ask that they go to the university, and we were talking about this a few meetings ago as well, of that universities keep some of the money as well. And so here they keep, I think it's 15%, I'm not sure, and there's like it gets like 20, I'm being corrected here, 20%. And so like that's something that we need to take into account too. Like how does it have to go to an institution? I was going to put it in the comments of, I'm not sure with the new system that PSA has, that Nick started talking to me about it, the new sponsor system that they have, which I still don't completely understand. I don't know if you go around that having to have the money in an institution, and so that would be interesting as well.
Maybe if I also may, in relation to some of these payments. So yes, of course, there's a loss of a direct payment. For example, if the PSA pays somebody via PayPal, there is a direct loss there. But it's not the case that when you pay from institution to institution, where it seems like you have exactly the same amount going from one institution to the next, that there are no, and I think Neil pointed to this, that there are no costs associated to it. It's just that they have been paid for already in a different way. For example, from a grant, just, you know, from, I don't know, taxes, but we're paying it directly in one transaction. That's why it looks like it's more, but it's just simply we're using a different service to get it there. And I think longer term, we should evaluate, you know, what are the higher costs. So initially, we're relying on this fiscal sponsorship to deal with this, because legally it's just a lot less complicated, because it means that we rely on some kind of administrative backend that protects us in case things go wrong. But longer term, hopefully we'll be able to hire our own staff so that those costs on each transaction go down. But of course, it requires quite an investment to be able to hire those people to do that work for you. So there will probably be a balance that we need to seek in terms of, okay, when is it worthwhile to hire our own staff to do that work for us? Because it is relatively expensive per transaction, but it's probably still cheaper than to get people on accounting and legal for the PSA.
Yeah, and I mean, this goes back to the larger point that this is not going to be free. It's always going to cost money. The question is how much money, and from where. So, you know, the fiscal sponsor, one of the reasons for that is their transaction costs are actually cheaper than going through at least a lot of American universities, right? So our overhead costs here at Cornell, for instance, are 57%. So that's a high. So that's what pays for in the back end why it becomes easier and free to transfer and cover other costs in the end, but it's not actually free. they've just taken their cut from the very beginning. And so a fiscal sponsor, it looks like we're paying a lot when they're actually transferring the money where it needs to go, but compared to 57%, it's a lot cheaper. And Ashland, I think, was 30% or something like that. These numbers vary a lot depending on where you are, but it's always going to cost something. And so, given the problem is that these costs vary around the world. They vary because of some of the other issues we've talked about, given exchange rates and different restrictions on what you can do with the money depending on where you are. Some of those are also like, so going back to the participant payment example, Nadia, that seems like maybe either an institution thing or even country level perceptions and what research costs and what you have to pay for. Like, it is baked into the US research ecosystem that you should compensate participants, right? Somehow you either give them money or you give them something else, but that's sort of baked into the legal and institutional regulations of participant protections in the US. Whereas there may be other contexts where that's viewed as like, maybe you're bribing people for research or something, whatever the case may be. Like, there are real regulatory hurdles in thinking about what money can be spent on. But these are some of the things that we're trying to figure out, is how can we, as a global kind of institution, operate given how much complexity and variability there is around the world. There's been stuff happening in the chat.
I don't know if we want to kind of keep on what the barriers are, and I'm sure I'm not the only one. I could just stay here all day and complain about things, but I don't know if we want to kind of talk about what maybe some of the solutions we might be able to come up with, or we may be thinking very linearly about, like, oh, we can just do grants, or we can just do have nonprofit institutions give us money. How can we? What are other ways that that we can get support for what we're doing, either institutionally or even like Mexico's a very collective culture, and I know it seems really weird sometimes, but we have like just fundraisers for science. So like somebody's gonna like they have a trip to, or not a trip, but like an exchange program with Europe, and you sell hamburgers so that you can get your plane ticket, or so I'm just throwing stuff out there. So what are there any solutions that could be, maybe, sorry for the saying of like thinking out of the box, because everybody says thinking out of the box, that we might not be thinking about. And I think one of Crystal's suggestion was really good, but are there any other ideas we might have, not just grants, but any other thing that we can think of? So I'll open it up, and I think Aish had something here that I didn't say. For me, one aspect is training, providing someone the intellectual resources to help them pursue their own local pots of funding, but also help identify global pots of funding as well. Much of the solution, however, must be systemic, fiscally accessible publishing institutional practices, where the fiscal responsibility and power can fall to the researcher. And I think that's also very important. I think a lot of us, when I talk to students here in Mexico, of like, okay, you can go do and there's one of my very wonderful undergraduate students that's here right now, got into grad school in the States. And I think it's a lot of hidden curriculum that we have of like, okay, we don't know where to get grants. We don't know that you can be a TA. We don't know, like in the States, I love that there's, apart from postdocs, that there's postbacks. There's all of these other opportunities that you have that we don't know. And I think that's something that we can slowly start maybe within ABRIR having something like what the Google sheet that Hans put up of like, these are some of the opportunities. And I think Twitter has done a bunch of stuff of like, these are all the grants that you can get as a grad student, or these are all like these hidden curriculum stuff. And I think Amelia, who's here, I think Psyching Out has a lot of materials like that too. But I think that's part of the things of like how the global north can help us in the global north. And I don't like that terminology either, but you know, it's one that's easy to use. So I think sharing knowledge is a great one, Aisha. Like, it's not just about the money, it's about like, how can we get the money, but also how can we access information? How can we access knowledge? How can we access like knowing how to do things? And I think that's something that sometimes we don't, we take for granted as researchers. I think Aish has something here too. No, I mean, Alma. This is not that closely related, but I think language barrier is important. For instance, SPSSI provides grants to the researchers from the Global South, but also dissertation awards open to everyone working in social issues. However, in both cases, grant application projects and doctoral theses have to be written in English, which means that dissertation awards is not open to many students from the Global South pursuing their PhDs at universities where English is not a language of instruction, although that is an award, not a grant. And it comes with a nice amount of money, considering SPSSI is aiming at a research on social issues. It's something to think about. Aish is here. And of course, exchange of resources. We have access to, India has always been brilliant at exporting human resources. I think representative populations are not resources we could offer. Valid point, Alma. Also normalizing posting your past successful applications online, I think is really important. I've seen some researchers make their apps access to their websites. And I think just grant applications being in English is like really hard, and how to apply. And that's something that a hackathon we're gonna have tomorrow, of how do you write a proposal for this big team science things. Yeah. So.
Yeah, I mean, those points are helpful to think through, and you know, especially the language one. Because it is a problem, again, given the where the money lives and where it needs to go, right? And who is reading these proposals and making these judgments. It is, you know, a lot of the big funders that we're talking about, they are in English-speaking countries and looking for English proposals, which adds then another layer to the process of getting the resources. You have your great idea, then you have to figure out how to translate it, and then also translate it, not just literally translate it, but translate it in the format that they are looking for. And back to the hidden curriculum thing, like what a successful grant looks like for one kind of funder looks different than for a different kind of funder. And that's true even if you're already in the English context. And so it just adds all
even to that. So at our university, we have grant consultants that see the reviews every year from like major funders. And without these consultants, I wouldn't be able to even get close to a successful evaluation. I never even got these grants because they're super difficult to get. But at least I got somewhat close, and without these consultants, it's impossible. And these consultants are not cheap.
And,
So
and that's part of it too. Sometimes, like I tried putting together, NIH is putting out a bunch of like Global South initiatives. There was one for mental health, and I put together a great team, I think so, And like, I thought it was a decent enough application, and I was not able to submit it because I think .gov didn't talk to the dot whatever other one that had to talk to. The NIH website wasn't connecting to .gov, and it was the first one that our university was trying to put together. And it took us days to try to put it up, and I just couldn't. I just didn't, because I just, like, we didn't know how to. And in the States and in Europe and all of these places, you have people that just know, not only like help you put it together, but also know how the website works. And I think that's something that that would be really helpful for us. I think we need to like just like be, I don't know, sister universities or something like that, of like, oh, we can put, as Natalia was saying, that welcome grants are coming out, or the European Union. There's one, I think, from Volkswagen, from people that are in Germany and like the global South as well, that are they're coming out a lot of like doing things with the global South, of just like not only like getting the money, but like how do you put it together? Is important.
This is part of the tension here, though, with doing things independently as a PSA collective, or whichever one of our collectives we're talking about, versus via our universities. Some of our universities do have teams that can do all of that. So like here we have a grant office that will do all of that. When I'm writing a grant here, I only have to focus on the science. There's an office that like really focuses on everything else. But this is then part of the tension, and this has come up with some of the big infrastructure PSA grants that we've put together, where, you know, the office here will do that under the condition that then they get to take their usual cut, right? So they're like, this, it costs a lot of personnel time to double check everything and make sure it is in exactly the format and flows the way that it needs to flow to have a reasonable shot. But then if you get it, that part of the overhead to pay all those people, that's why they take their cut. At least that's the argument here. So that's some of the tensions that we run into then, is like, to put all the resources behind it. Institutions are willing to do that, or individual institutions might be willing to do that, but only under the condition that you pay their fee. And so that's part of the constant trade-off. And when do we do this as a collective PSA entity? When do we do this as like a collection of individuals, as institutions that will then fund, have the PSA as sort of a subcontract, if you will, for what we do? These are some of the, we need some decision rules around that. Yeah.
I just wanted to make a last point. I need to jump out pretty soon, unfortunately. But I would just wanted to make a last point to kind of challenge people to think about funding in a different way too, because we've been mostly now talking about grants, and particularly from the perspective of the PSA. I personally don't think that that should be the sole source of income. So the way that I see it is that, so we should still focus some of our time on grants, but essentially grants are high risk, high gain opportunities. So the base rate that you get them are typically very low, depending on country, on grant agency, between, I think, 5 and 15%, typically not higher. So that's a super small chance. Sometimes you can get a lot of money that way. But I don't think we should focus our sole efforts on writing grants, but we should also, and I think Nadia kind of pointed towards in a previous comment, also to other kind of efforts. So we could consider, for example, you know, developing services that the PSA can provide. But of course, then we still need to think about how to do this in an equitable way. So to make sure, you know, that it's the people that have the money that pay for it. And the people, for example, if we think about training, we want to make sure that people that don't have the money still get access to the resources and so forth. You know, I think one of the things that I would also like to invite you to help us think about is how can we fund the PSA in creative ways, also in a way that basically we can redistribute some of that money to members around the world. And given that we probably only have a minute left, I definitely won't start a discussion, something related to members.
We've had this
That,
discussion many times.
Yes.
I love the idea of offering services. I mean, we have a lot of expertise within the PSA, and I think that there are ways that we could potentially charge, reasonable fees to provide that expertise, as folks are able to provide it. I think especially thinking about, I mean, all the expertise that the translation and cultural diversity team has, for instance, right? And I think that there could be a system set up by somebody that's smarter than me, on how to allow those folks to get paid for their efforts, but also perhaps having an overhead cost, right? That does go to the PSA directly to be used as needed for funding other stuff. I think that would be a really interesting avenue to pursue. Membership fees are less interesting to me.
Yeah, I mean, the using the expertise we have by Hans, the expertise we have on things like translation, we've talked about that a few times. It runs into another issue that I think the board would just need to decide, and we can certainly propose this to them. But one immediate thing that comes to mind then is, to do that, the PSA essentially becomes an employer, right, of the translators. That creates one set of things that the institution needs to deal with, but then it also creates things that, say, the individual translators would need to deal with, right? Like, what does that mean to essentially have a second job where you'd be working for the entity? How does that run into whether it's like, so, research universities in the US often have consulting clauses, so like then it might be fine. But if you don't have such a clause and you're working for another entity, how does your primary employer feel about that? There are all these like logistical things that they're not insurmountable. I think we can overcome them, but it does require a different set of processes, legally and financially, to set those things up. And so if it's a road we want to go down, we would just need to come up with a plan for that, propose it to the board, think about what it means with the fiscal sponsor, who I think would have to deal with the tax implications of that, and all the people involved. Like, what does this look like to have this sort of secondary employment opportunity? Let's say if you're in a different country, and the US, even the US rules about hiring people in other countries, what does that mean? Like, we just have to work through all of those things if we want to go down paths like that. Again, I think we could do it, and there are potentially a lot of upsides there, but there are some real legal and logistical things to work through to get there.
There are comments here too that like that's a way that you can directly like help the global south that way, of like, even if it's, we make like, let's say we make, I don't know, $3,000 or like $5,000 or $10,000, and PSA keeps 70% of it or 80% of it. That $2,000 for a grad student in the global south is just like an incredible amount of money. And it could be, and I think we can find creative solutions for that. It could be maybe not a payment, but like grant for their research, or even a scholarship that especially for like graduate students, that since we're going to be a nonprofit, it could be used for that, and maybe have a requirement that they're graduate students. And so, and I'm just like thinking out, like just brainstorming here, making it a scholarship. And so maybe that way it kind of, I don't like saying evades, but like, it goes around maybe some of the taxation issues, rather than like, having to deal with all of those complicated things. And it is that. It is like, it's a way of training people, and it's a way of like giving people the opportunity to do science and to be able to do all of these things. So I think rather than just like providing an income to PSA, it's giving the opportunity to a lot of like people that need it, that need the scholarship, that need the experience. Sometimes even here in Mexico, just having the certificate that you were part of the team that was doing translations, or like just having, it's something that I absolutely hate from Mexico, but there's a saying here, papelito habla. So it means like paper speaks. So it means that if you don't have a piece of paper that says that you did something, it doesn't count. So I think both, and I think we've discussed it within the Funding and Financing Committee a lot, of like, how do we do this? I think it would be great in many fronts, of like providing experience, of providing certificates for students or researchers from the Global South, providing funding for PSA, providing funding for researchers. I think it's a good solution. I think, and Natalia put here, I did provide services for University of Texas at Austin for a while as an RA, and it looked like a lot of work from their side. It is a lot of work. There was, I'm like part of like Arizona is super close to here, and I'm part of like a kind of binational, it's like whatever research thing, and it took a lot of paperwork, and I was and I'm a citizen, so it was less difficult because I was a citizen. And if you're not, you have to like provide so much other paperwork, and I'm not being paid. It was just like, we're going to be research friends. So it is kind of something important. And Crystal says, it may be depending on whether PSA or a university sends the money, and how, for example, a scholarship, meaning it could be more or less work. I don't know if anybody else has an opinion about this.
No, yeah, I actually forgot about that. I just remembered. I was in Brazil, and I worked for a lab, and I had a remote training, and I signed a contract, and it was a very interesting experience. I think it changed a lot of how I deal with. I learned a lot about how to work with collaborators abroad. So I think one positive thing that could come up with that would be also, I don't know, people will always complain about things, but I think a lot of students and colleagues don't know how to deal with international collaborations, how they should negotiate, how they should say things. And one of the experience that helped me learn how to do that before PSA, because I wasn't on PSA already, but on PSA we are much more friendly, and we are not paid, so it's a voluntary job. Like, I love PSA. I always tell people should join PSA. But I learned a lot about how we should impose and learn from professional. I learned from professional collaborations. So I think people from countries like Brazil and represented with better. They learn more from these. They could learn more, and I think I don't know. I think I support the idea. I wanted to say something about that. Is I I completely agree with Nadia, and now that I'm on the other side of academia as a professor, it's a completely different experience now, because people actually, you have like sort of more power. I think I sort of had the impression that I froze a bit. Is that I'm talking about ABRIR here to students, and I had the student helping me, and giving a certificate to students actually helps a lot. Helps a lot, and I think PSA could have more of a paying is always good, but I think we could work better with providing these documents, like these declarations or certificates as well, to some research communities, some like as in Brazil and Mexico, where people benefit in their CVs from these. Yeah.
Yeah, Alexandra put here, I know some nonprofits in Serbia had experts from abroad come for a year or so and are paid for it, and help organizations apply for funding during their time there. I don't know if that could be applied to the academic context. One of the things that happened after I wasn't able to submit a grant, because I was going to say I didn't get the grant, but it was I wasn't even able to submit the grant, is I talked to the University of Arizona, and they said that they would be happy to come and like give us courses, or do an online course of like how you deal with like .gov and like the whole NIH system to try to do that. And I think that's a great resource to have. Of course, the University of Sonora and University of Arizona are like very, very tight, and we're very close geographically, but also the states do a lot of commerce, and the universities have a lot of like interests together. So it is in their interest to like help us out. And I think a lot of people in the PSA have the knowledge that could help us out as well to do that. So I think that one of the things that we wanted to do in ABRIR was kind of do that transfer of knowledge of like, okay, what do you guys have that we don't, and what do we guys have that you don't? And so I think that's important. And Heidi was saying, I've been involved in some recent chats with NSF folks, and they mentioned that while we could send NSF money to international partners, we could apply for money for money to do international training workshops. Yeah. So I think those are things that we're not even thinking about. Like, we're just saying we want grants and we want infrastructure and we want this and we want that, but we're not really, if we really want to diversify, we need to think of these mechanisms that are already in place. Like most US universities I know have, like, even if they're not huge grants, they're like, if each person can apply for these. We did an exchange program with the University of Notre Dame, and we got a 10K grant, which is like, again, it doesn't sound big for US or for Europeans, but it's huge here in Mexico. We got a bunch of money for participant pay. We were able to get even some infrastructure work here done. So I think even just thinking of those small ones of like just applying for those things, I think it's really important. Aish, in terms of training and workshop funding, we get a lot of funding in India from government institutions to invite researchers over. And we have some things here too. I'm not sure. I remember Natalia, when I just met her, you were asking about that, of like, how do we get people over back and forth? And I think that's important too. Like being, and I think a lot of people don't think of like, oh, when you go and give talks, you go and give talks to, oh, I'm going to go from Cornell and I'm going to go to Stanford. And I think we need to start thinking of like, okay, I'm going to go from Stanford and I'm going to go to University of Sonora. And most people are going to be like, the University of what? And those are the universities that you need to start going to, like the ones that really need your knowledge, the ones that you can, you really can make a difference. So I think that's a great great idea from both Heidi, Neil, and Aish. Sips is, Aish is inviting people to go to India. I'll go. I don't know what I can teach you, but I'll go.
You're first on my list.
I was just talking about that days ago. Like I have friends in Mexico, in India, and in Japan, in Bosnia. I can just ask them to receive me there when I go there. Anyway, like looking forward to. I realized I thought my mic was here and it's here, but anyway. So something that I wanted to say also is about local funding is I had a recent experience with that. I don't know how it could fit in the international funding experience. This is something that I said before on PSA, is that it's more difficult, I think, but we can always try to apply to local funding regarding PSA, and then have people from PSA supporting. So I'm collaborating in an application here in Brazil, which is a network of researchers. So it's a national collaboration. And we have also international collaborations for these. So it's not my project. It's like someone else asked me to join, and then I asked other people to join. So one of the requirements is to have a national network of researchers. And then we asked, and also it's good to have international collaborations. And this is something that I think we can do with PSA as well. So having a project related to PSA and ABRIR, and asking people from PSA to join as collaborators or consulting. Oh my God! Yeah, I'm saying like I had COVID a couple of months ago, so I'm blaming COVID now. I'm forgetting words. So yeah, for these projects, yeah. So just also a suggestion that perhaps we could now that I can apply for these things, because before I couldn't as a postdoc, because postdocs can't apply for these things. So I'm suggesting this.
I'm going to be like a little kid. Now that they're gone, we can talk about the dreaded membership fees. No, I'm just kidding. I think one of those, it's a discussion that we've had a couple times within the funding and financing committee. There's not a lot of us here, but I can ask the people that are here, and I can ask over people that are sitting here with me of what do people think about membership fees and how that affects your decision to become a member of a society, keeping in mind that there's waivers for it. Like for example, SIPS has a waiver. I know the Society for Research in Adolescence has a waiver. I'm part of the SFN, Society for Research in Neuroscience. They don't have a waiver for Mexico. They have a reduced fee. It's not huge. I think it's like maybe $20, which is not huge for me. And I think it's a lot lower for students. And so it is something that has been brought up a couple times about well, that's one way that we can start bringing funds in. I think Crystal came up first, and then Neil.
Yeah, I think in my experience working on a global engagement task force, folks aren't really huge fans of membership fees for certain kinds of organizations, and I kind of feel like PSA is probably going to be one of those organizations because people are already volunteering like a lot of time and effort. And so having a membership fee on top of that would probably feel like you're paying to volunteer, which doesn't really seem like you're not, especially for groups that are within the organization that you're not getting a publication out of. So like I was the assistant director of the community building and network expansion committee for several years along with Natalia, and we didn't get any publications or anything out of that. There was no immediate like job benefits. I mean, I hope I speak for Natalia in saying that I really enjoyed that, but I can't imagine paying to volunteer that time. And so I think that that would be a struggle, especially for folks where money is already an issue, especially in countries where the currency swings a lot. That was something that we heard a lot in when we were doing the global engagement task force report, was like people were like, it can be really, really, really expensive depending on when those membership dues come in. And people don't like asking for waivers. But one other thing that I wanted to share just kind of generally is that there was this really great report by Marcel Laflamme, I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly, around how people are starting, especially early career researchers are thinking about society membership, and like people are just being more strategic with where they're putting their money. And so there are a lot of people leaving like larger organizations like the APA. I mean, I don't know if their overall numbers are drastically dropping, but like people are reporting like leaving the APA because their values don't align with the values of the organization and just stuff like that. So people are just being a lot more strategic. And so I worry that I have a lot of worries about the idea of implementing a membership fee structure for PSA specifically.
To quickly add to that, I've been on some of the committees for some of the larger societies, and one of the things that's very clear in that data is even the big American societies, people pay membership fees when they're going to the conference, and that's the biggest driver of getting people to pay. When they don't go to the conference, they don't pay membership fees. And so that's just another piece of context to keep in mind of what are you paying the membership fee for? Will also affect whether or not people are willing to do it. It's just another piece there.
Yeah, Heidi's saying that's often true for me. I think it's 100% true for me. I like forget, apart from like the money, it's just like, oh, I was like, oh, I was remembering it, like it's overdue, and it was overdue like 3 years ago. Like this is the first time that that I was maybe last year I went to the virtual SFN, and it was like the first time I paid a membership fee in like, I don't know, 10 years, because I just didn't think about it. One of the things that Alexander put here, sorry, I didn't mean to. We'll edit that out, Heidi. And I put myself out there with you too. So currently free writing for all the fees is what Alexander was saying, because I'm a doctoral researcher, and you can pass as a student, but it will become inaccessible for me going forward probably. And it moved up. Sorry. And I would have to choose just one society to be a member of. Also, even if I didn't plan to, I had to pay a fee to become a member of one of two societies so far, just to get a conference fee discount or so that I could apply for a grant. And I think that's one of those things. I think one of the reasons why people pay fees is to get something out of it. And I'm not sure if we're giving necessarily something like tangible to it. Like you get a discount, or you get to apply for a grant, or for example, like Saikai has a one in a lifetime fee, but then you can apply for grants, or you can there's a lot of other things that you can do after that. And I'm not sure PSA would do that, but maybe if it becomes like the buy-in becomes enough that maybe you do a membership fee and then you get a grant afterwards, then it might make sense. So I think we need to like go through it very carefully and see who, what it is that we're offering, like Neil was saying. And then Crystal saying interdisciplinary folks also have a lot of more burden with membership fees because there's no one organization to belong to. And it happens to me a lot too. Like it's SFN, it's APA, FPS, like it's just like so many of them that you're not just applying just for one. And so then if you add PSA, I think it would reduce membership, but also it would reduce diversity, which is one of the other things that we're really trying to push for at PSA. I don't know if anybody else has a comment about this. If nobody does, I think we can start to think about the closing remarks, or Hans left the Google Docs there, and this is more of like a thought-provoking like hackathon, like how can we get things started? Heidi put on the chat of like, because I had suggested maybe trying to do something for in BTS of like a hackathon of where we have more, not just PSA, not just ABRIR, but more like of the many labs things of like how can we start thinking about how do we raise money for the many-manys. So I think this is just like the beginning of like, how do we think about this, and how do we not only bring more money for PSA, but how do we bring money to low and middle income countries? Like how are we going to increase representation? How are we going to increase diversity? How is this going to get better for all of us? So I think it was a nice discussion. I don't know if anybody else has something else to add.
Yeah, I mean, I just building off of what you're saying in the broader discussion, the reason we are here in the first place and have this problem in the first place is that there are these large and persistent inequities in our society that created this problem of resource differences that led to the larger problem of some groups being completely excluded in the first place. So if we're not going to address those larger systemic issues, we're just going to keep talking around this problem forever. And one of the things that I've looked at over the past couple of years is just how long we've been talking about these problems. In my area alone of the field, in social psychology, at least since 1986, every 10 years, there's a paper written about this problem, right? And little progress being made. And so we have to find some ways of really addressing the larger issues of funding and resources in order to really address these problems, or we're going to just keep talking about it. Every 10 years, we'll write another paper about, oh, look, we still have this problem, we still have this problem. And so whatever we can do to try and solve those resource problems, I think will help us really move the needle. We can't otherwise. So thanks for taking the time to start this conversation, but I hope we'll continue working on it moving forward.
Yeah, your work is inspiring. We were writing this APA piece that Miguel invited us about like Latin America, and it is like just very striking of how it was initially like prompted to be like an applied versus basic science, and like reading your work and reading other works of like how that is part of the systemic issue of like keeping certain fields down, certain like a whole, like not just geographically but methodologically things. And I think that's one of the objectives that we have here in ABRIR, of like increasing diversity and increasing representation in everything, in methods and people, in geographic, in situations and research topics and everything. And so I think it's just like the first thing, and I hope we continue with the steam of like in October see each other in BTS. I don't know, insert joke here about pop, K-pop. I'll come up with a better one next time. You know, just as Neil is saying, like not. I know it maybe hurt Natalia's feelings last time. I was saying like just yelling at the Twitter void may not help us. I love you, Natalia. It does help. It's how we get together, but actually doing some of these things, like how do we move forward? How do we do things to make it better for everybody? And I think our voices need to be heard, and we need to learn to speak up too. I think a lot of us are afraid of like, well, my voice doesn't count or my voice isn't important, but I think everybody's voice is important. And if we don't say, well, membership fees would hurt me, or one thing or another thing might be better for me, then we're going to keep with the systemic issues that we have. And I know it feels like it's like, but it's our responsibility to like change things, but I think it's everybody's responsibility. And I think Neil and I think Hans to start like thinking of solutions and start thinking of different ways that we can help each other out, and of course help psychological sciences to be better, and all of us be better. And now we get to sing Kumbaya or something, I don't know. So I really, really want to thank Neil for being here, and Hans, even though he's not with like a cute little toddler. It's so difficult to like have everybody in different time zones. Brendan, for being here. It's like an awful time for you and Aish, that it's super late in India, and which is another barrier again. But thanking everybody for being here, having your voices heard. Let's work on the Google Docs. If you haven't joined either PSA or ABRIR, like join our Slack, and let's continue this this conversation so that we can make it better.
Thank you so much for organizing us, Nadia. Glad we had time and space to have this conversation.
Yeah. Well, for those of you that are in the morning, people here want to clap. You can clap.
Thank you all so much. Yeah.
And for those of you that it's morning, have a good morning. You can go have breakfast. We're gonna have some pan dulce here and some coffee. If not, go have a great lunch. Yes, food, Crystal. And for those of you that need to go to sleep, have a great night. And thank you all for being here.
Thanks, and take care, everyone.
See you in a half an hour for the next one.